Now what I propose to do is to present the case in favor of the documentary hypothesis. Now bear in mind that I don't believe the documentary hypothesis, but I do want you to know how strong the case can be made, and so I will present this as if I were a believer in it, though in a subsequent video we will seek to refute the whole theory. The documentary hypothesis is built primarily on the foundation of 5 pillars, you might call them: the divine names, language and style, contradictions, doublets, and composite sections. So we're going to explain what each one of these terms mean as we go through. First of all, the pillar of the divine names. The theory started with the question of why do some passages in Genesis use the term Yahweh and others use the term Elohim. Yahweh, God's personal name, usually translated in your Bibles as Lord with all caps. Elohim is God. And the answer that is foundational for the theory is that they come from different sources, where some sources like using Yahweh, others prefer using Elohim. Key text in this regard is in Exodus 6 verses 2 and 3. There it says that God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name Yahweh I did not make myself known to them. Now, proponents of the documentary hypothesis will argue this way, that, well, the patriarchs didn't know, according to this text, the divine name Yahweh. But Yahweh does occur in some passages in Genesis on the lips of the patriarchs. And so the argument then is that this is a part of the E source, but it's in contradiction to the J source, which has the patriarchs referring off and on to Yahweh. Which raises the questions, did the patriarchs know the name Yahweh? Well, no name in Genesis uses the divine name Yahweh. Many of the names, like Ishmael and Bethel, uses the divine name El, which is, you might say, a short form of Elohim. And so this confirms that statement in Exodus that Yahweh was not known by name by the patriarchs. Now, just to give you an idea, these are sources in Genesis, at least according to the analysis of Westermann. There are priestly passages, which starts with the first chapter, and Genesis 5, and parts of Genesis 6, 7, and 8, and 9, and Genesis 9, 28, and 29, Genesis 10, parts of Genesis 11. Those are all priestly writings. The Yahweh starts in chapter 2, where it refers to God as Yahweh Elohim, and then in chapter 4, and then in chapter 6, and blended in with the P in chapters, the flood account in chapter 6 through 9. And then you can see various other passages are ascribed to the J source, or the Yahweh source. The Elohist source doesn't begin until chapter 15, but there are E-source in chapter 20, 21, 22, 24, and so on and so forth. So they're splitting up Genesis into all these little sources. And at least the first criterion is the use of the divine name. The second pillar has to do with changes in language and style. For example, P, when it refers to the creation of the world and mankind, uses the Hebrew word bara, translated create. But in J's account of creation, it uses yatsar, which means to form, that God formed man from the dust of the earth. When you come to Genesis 5:1, it uses bara again, which indicates that that is a P source. Another word that is argued, another place where this is argued, has to do with the making of covenants. When you cut a covenant, it's usually translated to make a covenant, but literally uses the Hebrew word karat to cut a covenant, and that's the language of J and E. But P tends to use the Hebrew word for to establish when it talks about making a covenant. To establish a covenant, the Hebrew word is hakim. And other words are used to make this distinction too. Sinai and Horeb are believed to be divided, both referring to the mountain where God gave Moses the Ten Commandments. But those are used differently according to which source, according to the theory. Who are the people that lived in the land? Are they Canaanites or Amorites? Again, it's argued that the different terminology represents different sources. That's the second pillar, language and style. Differences in style. In Genesis 1, you have P's account of creation. And being a priestly document, it's very ritualized. The 7 days are laid out, each with an evening and a morning. When you get to Genesis 5, you have genealogies, which are laid out very formally. And again, it goes along well with the hypothesis that these are priestly in origin. But when you get to Genesis 2 through chapter 4, you get J's account of creation, and it's much more of a colorful drama, much less formalistic. It's more just telling a story. A third pillar of the documentary hypothesis has to do with contradictions. Different sources can be seen to contradict other sources. One example, in P, man is said to be like God, but in J, God is said to be like man. So in P, Genesis 1:27, man is made in the image of God. But in Genesis 3, man is not like God. That's what Eve wanted to be. She wanted to be like God. And God, if anything, is like a man walking through the garden. Very anthropomorphic type language. In any case, man is prevented from eating of the tree in order that he might become, quote, like one of us. And so which is it? Is it that man is like God or God is like man? Proponents of the documentary hypothesis see this as flat contradiction. Is God a transcendent lawgiver, as in P, or is God human-like and present, as in J? In Genesis 1, God is transcendent, who rules by his word. But in Genesis 2 and 3, God doesn't seem to be transcendent over and above creation, but walks in the Garden of Eden with mankind. Here God worries about whether man should become like him. And again, this seems to be a contradictory view of God, according to the Wellhausen hypothesis, between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and 3. We will continue this in the next lecture.